Hi, I'm Hobie1. This is Red Chair Reading. I'm in Encinitas in North County, San Diego. Today we are reading The House on the Cliff, Chapter 12. Let's go. The Secret Passage. Cautiously, Frank and Joe made their way across the slippery rocks. Suddenly, there was a loud splash as Joe lost his footing. "Are you all right?" Frank whispered, as he came up to where his brother was standing in the shallow water at the edge of the cliff. "Yes. For a moment, I sure thought I'd sprained my ankle," Joe replied tensely, "but it seems to be okay now." "Give me your hand," Frank whispered, and quickly pulled Joe back onto the rocks. The Hardys had landed at a point some 25 yards from the tunnel opening, but the climb over the treacherous rocks was so difficult that the distance seemed much longer. It was very dark in the shadow of the steep cliff. The waves breaking against the rocks had a lonely and foreboding sound. "Good night," Joe muttered. "Aren't we ever coming to that tunnel?" "Take it easy," Frank advised. "It can't be much farther." "I hope Tony and Chet will hurry back with help," Joe said. "This is a ticklish job. If anybody's on guard here, we'll certainly be at a disadvantage." Joe remarked in a barely audible tone, "Watch out!" By this time, they had reached the entrance to the tunnel. After a few cautious steps, they discovered that the narrow piece of land between the water and the base of the cliff was covered by a thick growth of bushes. Frank turned to Joe. "If we try to walk through all that stuff," he whispered, "we are sure to be heard. That is, if those men are in here someplace." Joe grunted in agreement. "What shall we do?" Tentatively, Frank put one foot into the water from the rock on which he was standing. "It isn't deep," he said. "I guess we can wade through." The boys hugged the wall and started off. Fortunately, the water came only to their knees because there was a shelf of rocks all the way along. The brothers' hearts beat wildly. What would they find ahead of them? The boys had not heard a sound since entering the tunnel. It appeared that the men in the rowboat had gone on to some secret hiding place. "I think I'll risk my flashlight," Joe said in a low voice as they reached the pond. "We can't find out anything without it." He pulled one he always carried from its waterproof case and snapped it on. The yellow beam shone over the pond. There was no sign of the rowboat. "How do you think those men got out of here?" Joe asked. "Do you suppose there's another opening?" Frank turned the flashlight onto the steep sides surrounding the water. "I don't see any. My guess is those men hid the boat someplace. Let's make a thorough search." Slowly the brothers began to walk around the edge of the pond, brushing aside the heavy growth and peering among the bushes. They had about given up in despair as they reached the section by the far wall of the tunnel. Then, as Frank beamed the flashlight over the thicket, he exclaimed hoarsely, "Look, a door!" Joe whispered tensely. The door had been so cleverly concealed that it would not have been seen in full daylight except at close quarters. The glare of the flashlight, however, brought the artificial screen of branches and leaves into sharp relief against the dark cliffside. "This explains it," Joe said. "The men in the boat went through here. I wonder where it goes." In order to avoid detection, Frank extinguished his light before trying to open the door. He swung it open inch by inch, half expecting to find lights and people beyond. But there was only darkness. Luckily, the door had made no noise. Frank turned on his light again. Ahead was a watery passageway, some 10 feet wide and 25 feet long, with a ledge running along one side. At the end was a tiny wharf with a rowboat tied to a post. "This is fantastic," Joe whispered. "And it must have been here a long time. Do you suppose it's connected with the Pollitt place?" "If it is, it could mean old Mr. Pollitt was mixed up with smugglers," Joe answered. "Hey, do you suppose Snatman is his nephew?" Excited over this possible new angle to the case, Frank and Joe stepped onto the ledge. They dressed, then quickly inched forward. Reaching the wharf, they looked about them as Frank beamed his flashlight on the walls. "Hold it," Joe whispered. Directly ahead was a crude arch in the rock. Beyond it, the boys could see a steep flight of stone steps. Their hearts pounded with excitement. "We've found it," Frank whispered. "This must be the secret passageway." "Yes," Joe agreed, "and from the distance we've come, I figure that we're right underneath the house on the cliff. Let's go up." The light cast strange shadows in the passage through the walls. Water dripped from the walls. The boys tiptoed forward and stealthily began the ascent. As they crept up the stairs, Frank flashed the light ahead of them. Shortly, they could see that the steps ended at a heavy door. Its framework was set into the rock wall. Above them was only a rocky ceiling. When Frank and Joe reached the door, they hesitated. Both were thinking, if we go through that door and find the gang of smugglers, we'll never get out. But on the other hand, we must find Dad. Frank stepped forward, pressed his ear against the door, and listened intently. There was not a sound beyond. He turned off his light and looked carefully around the sides of the door to see if he could catch a glimmer of any illumination from the other side. There was only darkness. I guess there's no one inside, he said to Joe. Let's see if we can open it. Frank felt for the latch. The door did not move. It must be locked, he whispered. Try it again, maybe it's just stuck. Frank put his hand on the latch, this time also pushing the door with his shoulder. Suddenly, with a noise which echoed from wall to wall, the latch snapped and the door swung open. Joe stepped forward, but Frank put out a restraining hand. Wait, he cautioned. That noise may bring someone. Tensely, they stood alert for the slightest sound, but none came. Hopeful that there was no one in the area beyond, Frank switched on the flashlight. The vivid beam cut the darkness and revealed a gloomy cave hewn out of the rock in the very center of the cliff. The boys wondered if it had been a natural cave. It was filled with boxes, bales, and packages distributed about the floor and piled against the walls. Smuggled goods, Frank and Joe thought. The fact that the majority of the boxes bore labels of foreign countries seemed to verify their suspicions. Convinced that the cave was unoccupied, the boys stepped through the doorway and looked about for another door or opening. They saw none. Was this the end of the trail? But it couldn't be, the young sleuths thought. Those men went someplace. Bolts of beautiful silk had been tossed on top of some of the bales. Valuable tapestries were also lying carelessly around. In one corner, 4 boxes were piled on top of one another. Frank accidentally knocked the flashlight against one of these, and it gave forth a hollow sound. It's empty, he whispered. An idea struck him that perhaps these boxes had been piled up to conceal some passage leading out of the secret storeroom. He mentioned his suspicion to Joe. And if this is interesting to you, please boop the like button. You'll help the video spread to other people. Thank you very much. But how could the men pile the boxes up there after they went out? His brother questioned. This gang is smart enough for anything. Let's move these boxes away, and maybe we'll find out. Frank seized the topmost box. It was very light, and he removed it from the pile without difficulty. I thought so, Frank said with satisfaction. The flashlight had revealed the top of a door which had been hidden from view. The boys lost no time in moving the other 3 boxes. Then Frank and Joe discovered how it was possible for the boxes to be piled up in such a position, in spite of the fact that the smugglers had left the cave and closed the door behind them. Attached to the bottom of the door was a thin wooden platform that projected out over the floor of the cave, and on this the boxes had been piled. Very clever, Joe remarked. Whenever one leaves the cave and closes the door, the boxes swing in with the platform, and it looks as though they were piled up on the floor. Right. Well, let's see where the door leads, Frank proposed. He snapped off his light and with utmost caution opened the door. It made no sound. Again, there was darkness ahead. What a maze, Frank whispered as he turned on his flash and beamed the light ahead. Another stone-lined passage with a flight of steps at the end. Suddenly, Frank stiffened and laid a warning hand on his brother's arm. Voices, he said in a low tone and snapped off his light. The boys listened intently. They could hear a man's voice in the distance. Neither could distinguish what he was saying, for he was still too far away, but gradually the tones grew louder. Then, to the brothers' alarm, they heard footsteps. Hastily, they retreated into the secret cave. Quick, the door, Frank urged. They closed it quietly. Now the boxes. If those men come in here, they'll notice that the boxes have been moved. He turned on the light but shielded it with his hand. Swiftly, Joe piled the empty boxes. back onto the platform that projected from the bottom of the door. He worked as silently and quickly as possible, but could hear the footsteps drawing closer and closer. Finally, the topmost box was in place. "Out the other door," Frank hissed into Joe's ear. They sped across the floor of the cave, toward the door opening onto the stairs they had recently ascended. But hardly had they reached it before they heard a rattle at the latch of the door on the opposite side of the cave. "We haven't time," Frank whispered. "Hide!" The beam of the flashlight revealed a number of boxes close to the door. On top of these, someone had thrown a heavy bolt of silk, the folds of which hung down to the floor. The brothers scrambled swiftly behind the boxes, pressing themselves close against the wall. They had just enough time to hide and switch out Frank's light before they heard the other door open. "There's a bunch of drugs in that shipment that came in 3 weeks ago," they heard a husky voice say. "We'll take it upstairs. Burke says he can get rid of it for us right away. No use leaving it down here. Got to make room for the new shipment." "Right," the Hardys heard someone else reply. "Anything else to go up?" "No, I'll switch on the light." There was a click, and suddenly the cave was flooded with light. It had been wired for electricity. Frank and Joe crouched in their hiding place, holding their breaths in terror. Would they be discovered? Footsteps slowly approached the boxes behind which they were concealed. Well, that is the end of chapter 12. Thank you so much for joining me here in beautiful Encinitas. Catch me again for chapter 13. Bye.